Hi everyone. We're just going to give people until 5 past-ish to finish joining, and then we'll get started.
If anyone has any questions they already know they want to ask, there's a link in the chat to a Padlet that we've created for today's session. We'll be keeping an eye on that through the webinar and passing your questions along to the kind folks who've agreed to talk to everyone tonight.
I'm giving away in the broad section. Like they're trying to do
Hi everyone. If we can ask all of our lovely panel guests if they can unfreeze their cameras. The words are escaping me. Okay, we're going to do some brief introductions for everyone. Just kind of whatever you guys are up for sharing is fine. My name's Chloe. I'm going to be one of the hosts tonight, and I'm a second year trainee on one of the DClin courses. Liz, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Liz. I'm also a second year trainee on one of the DClin courses, and I'm just going to be hosting the webinar with Chloe and also a member of DClinPsy.
Molly, can you introduce yourself next?
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a first year trainee at the University of Leeds.
Danny, do you mind introducing yourself too?
Hiya, I'm Danielle or Danny. I'm a first year at Glasgow University.
Will, do you mind going next?
Hi everyone, I'm Will Curvis. I'm a clinical psychologist and a clinical tutor on the Lancaster DClin programme, and been involved with the DClinPsy group pretty much since the beginning, I think.
Thanks, Will. Lauren, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm a first year trainee over at the Leicester DClin course.
Thank you. And Janice, do you mind introducing yourself too?
Hi, I'm Janice Williams. I'm a clinical psychologist 2 days of the week, and for the rest of the week I'm a clinical tutor on the UCL DClinPsy course.
Thank you.
Cool, so this is going to be a follow-on webinar from anyone who came to our October one that looked at reflecting on being from a working class background for the applications. So firstly, I'm going to presume that a lot of people who are here might have got interviews, and that's why you're coming to the webinar, so congratulations for getting interviews to everyone who's got them. We're going to briefly go through a similar format to what we did last year and kind of ask questions of the panel about their experiences and a bit more general experience as well of doing interviews and DClin interviews. Like Chloe said at the beginning, if you do have any questions, we've got the Padlet, or you can just pop them in the chat as well, and we'll kind of go along and see how we get on. So the webinar will definitely end at 9, just for everyone's sanity. But yeah, we'll see how we go, and other people might join along the way, depending. Some people are stuck in traffic, etc. But hopefully that's okay with everyone as we go. Should we kick off with first kind of question? Yes.
Sorry, Liz, can I just check if we're happy to record?
We are. Oh yeah, I asked everyone that already. I'll put it on the information.
Yeah, just to let anyone in the audience know, then we're going to record this and put the video up on YouTube on our channel. So just bear that in mind if you're speaking up or adding any comments in at any point.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else that I missed, or should we just kick off with a question?
Sounds good.
Okay. So maybe if we start, I don't know who wants to go first. If we start with a question about what helped you start to think about how to reflect on being from a working class background. So what, maybe a bit about what motivated you, etc. And whoever wants to go in first, just jump in. Me and Chloe will try and referee.
I think for me, I watched one of these webinars, and that probably made me start to think and reflect about my own experiences of class, and how that had kind of impacted my journey up until kind of trying to get into clinical psychology and thinking about trying to get the AP post, and then thinking about I guess trying to apply to DClin. So I think I started thinking about it when I was like prepping questions about, like, you know, when you're thinking about like why is it clinical psychology that's important. So I think, yeah, my journey, I've had kind of lived experience of mental health issues within my family, and kind of been part of a multi-generational household. So I felt that was quite important to reflect on. And I guess, yeah, one of the things that I really found helpful was thinking about like social graces and intersectionality. There's a really nice model that looks at kind of voiced and unvoiced, seen and unseen, voiced and unvoiced, I think. I think it's one of Burnham's, like in the social graces paper maybe, or maybe in a separate paper, but that was really helpful, and I think I structured kind of my answer around that slightly.
Danny?
Yeah, it was just to kind of chime in with what Molly May said. I think for me it was about trying to stand out and talk about my experiences and how that kind of sets me apart from the pack, if that makes sense. And for me, I think a big part of my development was working alongside my degrees and the kind of challenges that faced, because I needed resilience, I needed determination. And I'd done kind of an open university degree, so that was all kind of self-directed. And I think the response from the panel was really positive, and it also kind of set me apart, dare I say, from the kind of other applicants. And again, that's because really it wasn't kind of feasible for me to go to university. I had to kind of work since I was 16, had main flat, do you know what I mean? So no, I think for me, a lot of the reflection was about, okay, well, what makes me different, and how is this going to help me in a course, you know, from the kind of training perspective, but also for the kind of clients and the people that we're going to be supporting as hopefully a qualified clinical psychologist one day.
Well,
I just wanted to respond to the points there from Danny and Molly by saying that I definitely didn't at interview stage, and I wish I had. Like, I don't think I had the language for it or the insight of it really, and I think that's kind of, for me personally, been something I've thought a lot about, you know, through training and after training, and has been a big driver in contributing to this group and being involved in this collective. I think for me, when I look back on, you know, my interview, admittedly it's a few years ago now, but when I look back on that, I think I see it as a bit of a missed opportunity to really showcase some of the individual aspects of my story, or what strengths I feel I might have been able to bring to the table. So I think it's really nice to see more people talking about that stuff and thinking about it. I think that's definitely something that should be part of the conversation going forwards.
Yeah, it seems like what Molly and Danny both spoke about, and Will, you kind of spoke about missing, was thinking about how you can bring more of yourself into the interview and try and be a bit more memorable, or what makes you kind of different, or what you can bring to the profession based on your experiences. Lauren?
I think for me it was really important realising when I was prepping that there was no right or wrong answer per se in terms of how I got my experience across, or you know, my kind of history or individuality. I think when I first started prepping for my interview, I tried to kind of make it fit into a neat, tidy box. And actually, when I was in the interview, it flowed a lot more naturally than that prep had kind of allowed me to let it. So I kind of looked quite widely about you know, how I felt as an individual and what kind of fit with that. So for me, I looked at the social graces, like Molly mentioned, and also Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems, which was a big thing that I kind of spoke about in my interview, because I'm quite interested in kind of systemic and the role of, I guess, the systems on each other, and it fit with what I wanted to say. And I think what everyone has mentioned so far is bringing your individual interests into your experience is really important, because I guess the interview is the time for you to showcase yourself, almost as if you're kind of like a cassette tape and it's your favorite tunes and you need to show yourself off. And it needs to be something that's valuable to you, and that's really important, and it will show in that interview environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you make about there's no right or wrong answer, because I think that with how the process for the DClinPsy is set up, it does feel like, well, there must be some perfect answer that I can give that courses must be looking for. And we know that everyone's application is so different. So bringing yourself and being able to think about your own individual experiences is just really important. I know a lot of you mentioned thinking about the social basis model, and Lauren, you just mentioned the Bronfenbrenner's one. Did you do anything else to help? Some people have mentioned like talking through things, or was models the best, or did some of you wing? Some people say that they wing it, which is just mind-boggling to me, to be honest. But I'm just wondering if anything else helped.
I think I was a bit of a winger, if I'm honest. I touched up on things, but I didn't try to cram absolutely everything in. I think my attitude was, if I know it, I know it. And the best advice that I was given is learn a couple of things really well, rather than try to learn everything, because those couple of things that you know really well are going to serve you better than trying to learn absolutely everything that is out there, which I don't think is possible when you're trying to prep for an interview. So touching up on some of the basics, I think I kind of brushed up on my understanding of kind of power and power dynamics as well, some of the models and CBT, and that served me the best, really, rather than trying to absolutely cram everything in.
Thanks, Lauren. Danny?
Yeah, I was just going to echo really what Lauren said there. I think I done myself a bit of a disservice, if I'm honest. So my Glasgow interview, I didn't prep a lot, if I'm honest. I literally just came out of a holiday, and it was quite kind of ad lib. I had a couple of examples in my mind of kind of cases I wanted to talk about, and people I'd worked with and what I'd learned from it. And that went really well. My Edinburgh interview, on the other hand, I had about 4 weeks in between, and I literally I got all in my head, and I was thinking, I've not mentioned enough models, I've not done enough kind of prep and research, and I need to sound more, competent and more knowledgeable. And I think I done myself a disservice in that interview, because I was so focused on kind of dropping in social identity theory and dropping in, all of these kind of models. The answers weren't as succinct and they didn't come across as well. And actually, I got a reserve offer, so it couldn't have been that bad. But I got I got the kind of first choice place in Glasgow, so that obviously was the superior interview.
So you tried both methods by the sounds of it.
And that's maybe just me. So maybe it might work for other people, but for me, I think I'd overplanned and I got in my head a bit too much with it.
Fair enough. I think that's really easy to do in these situations, because it feels like a lot's riding on it. Will, and just before you say, Will, I was just thinking from yours and Janice's perspectives, like being on the other side, do you think it's more obvious when people have like prepared a lot compared to, I mean, you're not doing what's in the earlier, compared to like when it's just more like ad lib or off the cuff?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to respond to Danny by saying. I think having done, been on the selection panels for a few years now, I think what always really comes across well is genuineness and enthusiasm and authenticity. And it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter what your experience is. If you're passionate for what you're talking about and you're genuine with it, that won't hurt. That will always stand you in good stead. And I think everything else is kind of icing on the cake, really. Then, there are particular things you might want to talk about for particular courses. For some courses, you might want to focus more on your research stuff or your academic stuff or your models or your experience or whatever. But I think underpinning all of that should be just bringing a bit of yourself to the table. I think, and it sounds a little bit twee almost. It sounds a little bit like I don't know, like it sounds a bit obvious, but I think the people who can put themselves across genuinely and be themselves and be comfortable in that environment, I think for me as being on interview panels, that always leaves me with a good feeling. You know, you always come away with a good sense of what somebody's about from that process. You know.
I just thought I'd just add a little something to that, which was a little bit back to I think what I can't remember if it was Danielle or Lauren said, but in terms of, you can always tell when trainees kind of know, interviewees have kind of learned really they've kind of skimmed over a whole load of different theories. And so then if you ask a question that kind of invites people to make links back to theories, and then they kind of chuck in the names of loads of different theories, but aren't really able to expand on it. And so I think it's always worth thinking about, if you want to think about some theories, to think about the ones that apply kind of transdiagnostically, apply in lots of different areas. So, attachment theory, the Bronfenbrenner stuff and things like that, and then think about actually, how would I apply this to a clinical case, or how would I apply this to something that's going on more generally in mental health services, those kind of things, rather than trying to scattergun, because that's definitely for me, that's you can always tell when there's that interviews have slightly gone into panic mode and are just trying to pull anything out and just kind of trying to throw things out. And I'd much rather hear about something in a bit more depth and hear it properly applied to the question that's been asked, rather than just sort of coming out with lots of different names of different theories without really thinking about how they apply to what you're being asked about.
Thanks, Janice. And do you think, just before I come to you, Molly, Janice and Will, like you say, it sounds like really obvious to just bring yourself and be genuine, but it's a really stressful situation and people can go into panic mode. So is there anything that might help people get into that zone, just so it's a bit of a familiar space to be in beforehand, do you think? Like to think about, or so maybe not thinking about a model answer, but just thinking about, how to get in that space where you feel comfortable, or how to put yourself across.
I think that's a really good point, Liz, because I think one of the things we've talked about in other classical insight webinars is this idea of like social capital, and that if you come from a working class background, you perhaps have less connections or opportunity to kind of learn how to be in certain situations, and interviews are a prime example of that. You might have had a bit less practice at being interviewed than other people who you might be up against. So I think my sort of advice, based on my personal experience, would be to get as much practice as you can. Ideally, if it's with people you work with, I mean, ideally a clinical psychologist if you've got access to one, but if not, just anyone that you work with, pull some interview questions off the internet and say, can you ask me these, and we'll do a role play. It's cringing, it's awkward, but it'll push you into that place of kind of being a bit anxious and thinking, can I still come across genuinely, and can I still think and articulate what I'm trying to say when I feel uncomfortable? If you've got nobody in a work context who you can do that with, find some friends, some family, find somebody to just be in a sort of an artificial role play type thing, where you just have a go at answering some questions under a little bit of pressure, and ask for feedback on those answers. How did those answers come across? How did I come across? Did I come across as nervous? Did I come across as cold or robotic, or did I come across as waffling and rambling? Get good feedback from people you trust. Just, I think, practice as much as you can, really.
Yeah, I'd definitely echo that. It's definitely worth saying this stuff out loud as well. It's one thing to read it on a piece of paper, but getting used to saying it out loud and explaining some of those key concepts, or talking about, what makes you a better candidate, things like that, but actually saying it out loud rather than just reading it off a piece of paper, because it will increase your verbal fluency and will mean that you come across better within the interview. And I did also just mean to say, because Will, I'm guessing the Lancaster interviews are still online, are they, as well? Or are you doing face to face now this year?
We're going back face to face this year, which is exciting. Yeah,
I wish we were, because I must admit, as an interviewer, it's really tricky. Because I completely understand how nerve-wracking this process is. And it's really hard through an online interview, through a Zoom interview, to, you know, provide that kind of reassurance to people and to help calm down those nerves that come with having an interview for the DClinPsy programs. And so I guess the other thing, so I always really feel for people when I can see them being really anxious, and it is harder to kind of help relax them or help kind of get things a bit under control. And I guess that's all I would say, is if you find that, you know, things really are spiraling a little bit and you just need a minute just to take a few deep breaths and to calm down, just ask us for it. We understand what the process is like, and it might be better to do that and just take a minute at the start to just get that system calmed down a little bit and then get into your flow, rather than trying to carry on and, you know, all of those vicious circles that we know about that can come in with anxiety and getting caught up in one of those. So that, I guess that's what I'd say. But I'd really hope we can go back to face at some point, but we're not for this year.
Thank you. Molly?
Yeah, I think I was just going to really echo and say that I found it so helpful when I started like practicing out loud, because I think my first interview, I had like a big gap last year. Had an interview at Manchester and then 2 months to pretty much till my interview at Leeds, and I had about a week between hearing back from Manchester and then having the interview, so it felt like a huge like cram, try and read every book, every paper possible, and it was awful. It was a catastrophic failure. But I think I really learned from that process that it was, you know, so important just to like really focus on knowing like the things that I knew really well, and just, you know, really developing my confidence and speaking those things out loud. So for like my case examples, I prepped a couple of examples, but then got really like used to saying it out loud, and thinking about, you know, what is it that, how can I like link my formulation in a way that isn't with arrows on the papers, like in a verbal way, like I'd be kind of expressing to an MDT, and that, I think that made loads of difference when it came to actually talking about cases and thinking about formulations and how I would like deliver that out loud during the interview. I think I also like found it really helpful just to think, you know, if a question comes up and it actually is going to be better for a case that, you know, I think about on the spot and it's not something that I've prepped, just to let go of the things that I had in my mind that I might be talking about, and just to go like with the flow, rather than trying to kind of squish something in that didn't really fit because I'd kind of prepped it and maybe knew it slightly better in my mind. And when I kind of let go of it and it felt like I was being, you know, I felt more anxious probably in the interview, delivering that, but I think I actually probably answered the question slightly better because I was just thinking on the spot and, you know, really thinking about what the question was asking me and picking a case that was most appropriate. So yeah, speaking out loud and then just letting go of all your prep if you need to.
Thanks, Molly. That was great summary at the end as well. Saved me some writing it for you. Lauren? Danny, I also can't work out if your hand is up or you haven't put it down.
Sorry, that's a legacy hand. I think it's up.
That's fine. Okay, Lauren.
Think as well, don't be afraid to ask if you can take notes during the interview. So one of the things that I found really valuable was taking notes during my interview, of actually giving myself that headspace to really process what I was being asked. Because I think in previous interviews for assistant positions, I would just hear the question and then want to respond as fast as I could, as, you know, as quickly as I can, everything I can. Whereas actually taking that time to process what was being asked of me, jotting it down and really thinking about what I wanted to say really helped. And I think we're naturally quite adverse to wanting to do that, or feeling like if we do that, I guess the courses will think ill of us, or we're going to get marked down. But it doesn't work like that, to my knowledge. It's, you know, that's actually a really useful tool to do. So yeah, and I can see Janice and Will have both put their hands up, so I'll leave it over to them to explain it more.
No, Lauren, I was just going to agree with you. I was just going to say, I think to my mind anyway, it's actually a really nice opportunity to show how you handle feeling anxious or feeling uncomfortable. And if you think about what the job is, quite a lot of the time, we have to sit with somebody else's distress while feeling a bit uncomfortable ourselves, and we have to try and help the other person feel a bit calmer. So I think being able to bring a sense of calmness and containment to a conversation is a really critical interpersonal skill that we kind of want in a psychologist, right? So I think actually showing that you can, you know, it's fine if you get a bit nervous, that wouldn't go against you. Showing that you can handle that by just taking a breath, by slowing down, having a sip of your water, writing notes, whatever it is that helps you to just slow the conversation down and calm the conversation down, I think will, in my experience, generally go across well. The last thing you want is for your interviewers to pick up, to feel more anxious and to kind of take that anxiety on, you know. So see it as a way of calming the conversation down as much as calming yourself down as far as you can.
But yeah, and just to echo that, you know, it's very common practice these days for people to ask to write down the question, or to make a couple of notes, or to take a minute just to think about what they want to say. And again, I think that's absolutely fine. But I guess also just to say that, you know, if you do start off on an answer and you get halfway through it, or you get 2-3 sentences in and decide you want to roll back and start again, then that's also fine. Just say that's what you want to do. You've had an opportunity to think about it a little bit more and you'd like to start again. That's also fine. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, we're clinical psychologists at the end of the day. We understand the impact of anxiety on cognition and attention and all of those things. So we, you know, we're definitely willing to make allowances for some of those things. And I think, just as Will said, just doing what you need to do in order to manage some of that is absolutely fine. I think it's also fine to ask for questions to be repeated if you haven't, you know, again, anxiety messes with our ability to pay attention. So if you've kind of not been able to focus on a question, especially if it's multi-part, because sometimes these questions are nasty and multi-parted. So if you've kind of lost track of what the second part of the question was, just ask us to repeat the second part of the question. You know, we want to see you at your best, I guess, is what we're trying to say. You know, we want to see what you're capable of, and we want to give you the opportunity to show us, really.
You're on mute, Chloe, sorry.
Sorry, I put my hand up to jump in with a question that's been asked on the Padlet that I think links in quite well with what you're all talking about, which is how have people gone about, or what ways can you suggest of managing the emotions that come along with something that might feel quite tricky to talk about in an interview? How have you balanced being reflective enough whilst also managing the emotions and sharing stuff that you feel comfortable with? So if anyone can speak to that, that would be helpful.
Danny?
Yeah, so I think just to kind of follow on from what Will's kind of put in the chat, I think it's a very personal thing, and you do need to have a bit of a kind of check, a bit of a self-care of, is it something you're comfortable talking about? Is it going to bring up anything? And what's the purpose of it? So for me, I shared my experience of therapy during my interview. And I felt as though it was important to share because this is what I've learned from being a patient. And I spoke a lot about kind of therapeutic alliance, and I spoke about kind of building that rapport with my own therapist. And for me, I felt that was kind of showing that I do have that understanding and showing that I'm a kind of empathetic person. And I feel like my experience as a patient does make me a better clinician in a way, because I've sat in that chair. I know how hard it is. I know how much work goes into going through a therapeutic intervention. But it was years ago. Do you know, I've had a lot of time to really process what my experiences were and be able to reflect on it without it igniting any emotions or making me feel uncomfortable. So I do think I can see the benefit of it, but I would obviously be really cautious of, are you in a place that you're comfortable talking about it? It would be my kind of advice.
Thanks, Danny. So kind of I guess linking back to what we were saying before, where people either do it off the cuff or not, this might be something that you might want to spend a bit of time beforehand thinking about and reflecting on what you want to share in this case. Will?
I was just thinking there as Danny was talking, for me, two of the things that I find myself saying a lot about interviews to people. One, it's not The Apprentice. You don't need to bamboozle us with force of personality or show us how you know everything about everything, you know. But secondly, it's not X Factor. You don't need to paint a sort of sob story of how difficult your life has been in order to show us how desperately you want this job and how much it means to you, you know. And I think sometimes people fall into those traps. I'm being a bit facetious here for the sake of silliness, but I think sometimes people fall into that trap a little bit of feeling the need to kind of persuade the interviewer how desperate they are for the job by by talking about things in a sometimes bit of an uncontained way. And I think it can be incredibly valuable to talk about personal experiences that have maybe been a bit difficult. I think, as Danny was alluding to, sometimes that gives you a different perspective on what it might mean to be a clinical psychologist or be a trainee clinical psychologist. So I think for me, that would always be the thing to come back to. How do I want this to come across in a way that shows that I would be a good candidate for training as a clinical psychologist? How can I show that this is, whatever type of interview it is, if it's a competency-based interview, how can I show that I have the competencies necessary to make a good trainee? And I think whatever examples you're drawing on, personal or professional, I would be asking yourself that question, like, what is it I'm trying to showcase here? And hopefully holding that in mind will help you to just make sure it's coming across to the interviewers in the right way, in the way that you would want it to.
So a bit like being flexible, like you say, not just trying to shoehorn an answer in to get something across that doesn't fit with the question by the signs, is what you're saying, Will. I mean, I very much like that metaphor. I think we should put it on a mug. Lauren?
It's about staying kind of safe yourself within that interview. I know for myself, I kept personal experiences to a minimum in regards to my interview, but the one thing that I spoke about was my personal values that have stemmed from my class identity, and how that kind of interplays with what I value as a clinician. So I kind of kept it very much to how that's influenced me as a professional, rather than all of this has happened to me in my life and this is why I want to do this career. It was more actually how it shaped how I want to be as a clinician. So it benefited me because it kind of showed, I guess, what I wanted from the career and how I kind of wanted to develop as a kind of trainee and then into qualified life. Rather than, I guess, like Will just said, coming in with all these things have happened to me and here's this package, now you've got to deal with that, which I think sometimes isn't helpful and sometimes might leave you after the interview feeling maybe unsafe in yourself, because it is a lot, it is emotive, and it's maybe thinking about how those things have shaped you to kind of come into this point today. So I know a big thing for me is I'm kind of like the first person in my family to kind of get to this point of education. Why is that important to me? Rather than kind of stating that fact explicitly, why is that important to me? Why does that matter? And reflecting on that. So I guess it's kind of thinking about those linking things rather than just the fact itself. I hope that makes sense. I just waffled on.
No, it does. Thanks, Lauren. I guess it's coming back to what people were saying, where don't just go on about models, think about how it links back to the formulation, take it to that next level, and that's kind of what the application asks you to do in a way when it's that question that I can't even remember what it is, but basically what would make you a better psychologist. It's not just about listing how great you are, it's about reflecting back on your experiences and applying that to the future and stuff, which is essentially reflective writing, which can be really difficult, a really difficult style to get into. Maybe we can come back to tips on that, but Molly, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say, I think beforehand, when I was kind of practicing questions with one of my supervisors, I think they asked a question about something about like how your experience, like quite explicitly asking about your experience and how that's kind of made you want to pursue a career in clinical psychology, just from a like random practice question. And I think I really noticed then that it was probably something that I was going to find hard to talk about just initially off the cuff. So I really thought about, you know, what was it that I wanted to share and really why did I want to share that? And yeah, so I guess I made the decision to kind of think about maybe a couple of key like headlines, like, you know, coming from a working class background has shaped my kind of thoughts or views around this, and then just using that to scaffold the point that I wanted to make, as opposed to that being the point itself. So yeah, just thinking about kind of the lens that that's given me, and how that's going to shape and influence the work that I kind of do, or the research or what have you, or yeah, how it shaped my interests. I think that's another nice one, if there is kind of a genuine link there. But yeah, I think I was just really careful about thinking, you know, I personally made the decision not to share anything really explicit, but just to think kind of more generally about those I guess headline kind of, you know, being from a working class kind of identity, and how that essentially shaped my experience.
Thanks, Molly. I think that was really helpful how you summarised it, like what lens does it give you? You know, how has that changed how you see things, the perspective that you now have? And I guess leading on from this, and we've talked about it a bit, we know from other webinars we've had and like talking within Classical Psych wider, some people can feel a lot of emotions when talking about whether it be their background or lived experience of mental health. What was your guys' experience of reflecting on it in interviews? Because a few of you, like, did it vary between panels or universities? Was it easier or harder? That type of stuff.
I think I kind of made sure that in between each of the tasks, I just kind of did something for myself. So rather than kind of sitting there staring at my computer waiting for the next task, I took myself away and did some kind of grounding, some mindfulness to kind of keep my kind of head in the game, but in a positive way. Because I guess it is a hard day, especially if you have quite a few interview tasks. So for myself, I had a written task, a role play, and the interview. And they were all in quite quick successions. And I could feel after each one getting quite exhausted and more emotional as I kind of spoke about stuff and explored stuff, and I could feel myself getting tired. And rather than kind of just sitting at my desk for the entirety of the day, I made sure I took those breaks. I think as well, I know we kind of spoke about it before, of taking those pauses in the interview, and I did use that of you know, before I answered, taking a breath, taking a drink of water. If it was a kind of double-barreled question of two parts, you know, kind of saying to the interviewer, I'm going to answer the first part and then I'm going to answer the second part and link them together, rather than, you know, trying to mash it all together, especially when you start getting quite tired and more emotional, and that anxiety starts to build even more because your window of tolerance starts to shrink, especially when you've got so many tasks being hit at you. And then doing something completely mundane after the interview, you know, not going back on your computer, and if you've got another interview, prepping for the next one, doing something for you afterwards, you know, whatever that is to serve yourself and your body. So for me, it was just, you know, coming downstairs and watching a film with my partner and, you know, relaxing with my cat, rather than going and reading more books on psychology and prepping for the next thing. That's not helpful.
Thanks, Lauren. It says that you definitely thought about what you would need after very stressful periods if you had a role play. A role playing interview and a written task. Like, they're just so full on, aren't they? So definitely think about what might help you in between. Will?
Just as you were talking there, I was thinking about how important that is. Give it again, just don't lose sight of the fact that you're applying to train as a psychologist, and a pretty big component of that is thinking about psychological well-being, our own as much as other people's. So I think, again, I'm being slightly facetious here, but I don't think I would want to go and see a psychologist who only ever thought about psychology and only ever read books about psychology and lived and breathed psychology in every minute of their day. You know, I think it's important to have balance. It's important to have different interests. It's important to have different things going on, and I think that's especially critical around interview time, because it is so stressful. It is so draining. It's hard work. I think I think in order to get through that and also to be at your best for any interviews you've got coming up, it's important to think about how can you look after yourself as well as you can, whatever that involves, whether that involves, you know, rest and restoration, or whether that involves doing something different, doing something more active, whatever works for you. But I, to be honest, I always quite like when people talk about that sort of stuff in interviews as well. That always gives me a bit of a sense that this is someone who sounds like they could maybe handle the demands of clinical psychology training, because, you know, sorry to, you know, be the one to say this, but it's not all sort of your life once you get onto training. That's when the work starts. It's tough, it's demanding. So you know, as an interviewer, part of what's in my head as I'm sat in an interview with somebody, I'm kind of thinking, you know, is this person going to be able to manage training? Is this person going to be able to handle it? And if somebody is able to reflect on and talk about how they look after their own psychological well-being, then that's for me, that's a big tick in the right box.
It sounds like there was something in what both of you said around just being a human being in an interview, and kind of remembering that and not trying to be a robot who doesn't need self-care, and that's really valuable. Danielle, you've got your hand up too.
Yeah, it was just when I was kind of thinking about my own kind of coping strategies during the interview. Mine wasn't as intense, luckily, as Lauren's sounds. We had a role play, and then I think there was maybe about a kind of 45-minute gap in the interview, and I had a dance party during that 45 minutes. I just kind of went down into my living room, you know, moved my table and literally just let out all of my nervous energy, do you know, that way. And it sounds silly, but it really helped. And I think it was just because I'd got myself really worked up, and then I didn't feel as though the role play went particularly well. And then I was like, oh God, you know, my interview, I really need to get into the headspace for this interview. And yeah, so don't know how helpful that is. But yeah, had a dance party. But yeah, just to kind of echo what Will and Lauren were saying, I think just being kind of human, and it's okay to take a breath and take a glass of water. That's quite a clever little trick as well. I think I used that as well. Had a little glass of water, and you know, if I needed an extra kind of 10 seconds just to collect my thoughts, I was having a sip of water before I answered my questions, and I found that quite helpful just to kind of settle me and to ground me.
It's that I think sometimes that silliness that you talk about, like, that's one of the tools that we have in all the jobs that we're in as well, and using that to cope with the demands of the interviews it's the silliness sounds silly, but it can be one of the most helpful things we have.
Also, I had a song that I would play before each interview that was just like a song that was like your hype song. I'm not going to tell everyone what it is, but I would fully recommend playing something like a hype song before each interview, just to get you in the zone and walk in and then walk out and then leave it all behind if you can. for a bit.
I was just going to say, I don't have a hype song, I don't think, but that's a good idea. But I was just going to say, I think so much of being a psychologist is about putting people at ease as well, isn't it? It's about being able to sit and have a conversation with somebody and to create a space where everybody in the room feels safe to talk. And I think, again, if you can bring a bit of that energy to an interview, it'll probably come across well. If you can help your interviewers feel at ease, you know, I think sometimes people are so focused on themselves they don't think about how their interviewers are feeling. But you know, having done it, I can see Janice is smiling. Having done it a few years now, it's a hard day. It's a long day. You know, it's exhausting interviewing. So the more that you can, yeah, put the panel at ease, and if it's appropriate, if there's space for a smile and a laugh and a joke, or if there's space for just a bit of a relaxed conversation, I think that again that can go a really long way. I think again it's sometimes a bit of an unwritten assumption that we have to go into an interview in a very and be a certain way, and I think sometimes that can come across as then a bit cold or a bit lacking in that our personalities, you know. So yeah, just to cycle back to what I was saying before, I think bringing a bit of that authenticity, you know, if you can bring a bit of that into the meeting, it'll probably help.
So that about being yourself in there, and it also reminds me about something you and Janice spoke about earlier around containing yourself and someone else. It's one of the key skills that we all develop in the work that we do, and using that in the interview for yourself and for your interviewer sounds like it's something that is received well all round. Janice, I noticed your hand was up.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about one of the things that the interviewers do at UCL is when we get together as an interview panel after we finish the interview, is we then think about the person we've just interviewed, and we think about a set of more generic questions about them. So, you know, would we be happy to supervise them? Would we be happy to have them on placement? You know, would we be happy to be their course tutor? You know, what would we think if one of our loved ones was, you know, was seeing them for some psychological work? And those questions have as much weight as the other questions that are about what did they know about this? How did they manage this question related to the clinical vignette? And so, you know, and lots of that stuff is much more of that kind of intangible stuff that is it intangible? I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it's much more that sort of generic stuff about how you make the interview panel feel during the interview, and sort of less, you know, related to the specific parts of the answers that you give.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that, Janice, I don't mean to make this sound more anxiety provoking, but I found this a helpful perspective to have. Like, I think always put yourself in the mind of the interviewer. Like, what is their job? And their job is kind of twofold. I think the first, it's about protecting the public. It's, you know, clinical psychologists work with very vulnerable people, so it's about making sure that we're selecting people who are going to be safe, who are going to be able to go and work with vulnerable people and be able to reflect on that honestly and openly in supervision and be organised and manage the demands of the course and all that kind of stuff. And then I think the other job of an interviewer fundamentally is, it's a really big investment. You know, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but you're talking, I don't know, 200 grand or something of public money to train a trainee clinical psychologist. So that's a big chunk of money to spend. And in order to kind of make that decision as an interviewer, it's important that the applicant's assuring the interviewers that they're a good use of that investment, that they're able to make the most of that opportunity, and that they're going to be able to do something good with that. And I think somebody gave me that perspective when I was kind of starting doing interviews, and I found it really helpful because I think that guided then what I chose to talk about in the interviews. How can I show the interview panel that I'm a safe pair of hands when it comes to reflecting in supervision? How can I show the interview panel that I would be able to make the most of training by doing X, Y, Z? Do you see what I mean? So I think thinking about it from what the interviewer's priorities are can be helpful as well. Again, sometimes we get a bit focused on ourselves when we're nervous, but I think trying to put ourselves in the mind of what are they asking me and why are they asking me this, I think is a good way to approach an interview.
And it's also thinking about readiness for training in September 2023 as well, isn't it? So it's not like quite often in an interview you have somebody where you're like, yeah, I think they'd make a great clinical psychologist, but maybe not just yet. So, you know, thinking that what you're trying to show the interview panel is that you're ready for training in 6 months' time. And as Will said, that, you know, you're obviously as trainees, you know, within the first 4 weeks of starting the course, you go on placement, you know, you see clients as a trainee in a different context to the ones that you'll have seen as an assistant or whatever roles that you've been doing prior to training. And as Will said, it's really quite a serious thing, and we need to take it seriously as interviewers for the courses as well.
It's a really helpful perspective, and it's not one that I had before I interviewed, I don't think. So I hope that's been something helpful for the people that are here listening tonight. We had another question in the Padlet around reflecting on accent during an interview. It's been discussed in previous clinical psychology ClassClin webinars. But is that something anyone thought about in the interviews, or is it something that anyone had kind of particular thoughts or feelings around when you were going into them? Molly May, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so I think it's not been something necessarily that I thought about an interview, but it's been something because I lived in Southampton, grew up kind of around that area, and now I moved to Leeds for training. So I've kind of come from, I've got a southern accent, and I live now in an area where there's a really different accent. And I don't think I reflected on how my accent would be perceived. So I think that people some people have made the assumption that I'm kind of posh, which has been really interesting because it's like something that I hadn't even considered before, because I guess, you know, that's couldn't be different from kind of my upbringing, and, you know, so yeah, I guess in hindsight, that might have been something to think about, depending on kind of the accent that you have and where your interviews are based. And maybe, you know, is that an accent different? Is it, you know, what's it going to feel like for clients to be working with you with a different accent? You know, what are they gonna, I guess, are they, you know, going to perceive your accent and have kind of biases or judgments about that accent? And I guess, you know, how is that going to affect you, and how can you kind of manage that? But yeah, as I said, that wasn't something I reflected on in an interview, but it has been something that's come up since, which has been quite interesting for me to think about anyway.
Yeah, I think sometimes when we think about accents, we think about it in a particular direction, and thinking about it all around is like, that's what reflection's all about, right? I think, did Lauren have a hand up first?
I was just gonna kind of echo what Molly said. So I didn't reflect on it within my interview, but it's come up since. So I'm from North Wales originally, and I've completely lost my Welsh accent since moving to the kind of Midlands. And I frequently get, well, you don't sound Welsh. Are you sure you're from Wales? I'm pretty sure I'm from Wales. And it's one of those things that we've had quite a few discussions as a cohort within my kind of group around kind of accents, and kind of differences, and, you know, how within accents there's also different dialects within that. And I think for myself, there wasn't the opportunity, even if I had thought about it, to discuss it within my interview, you know, thinking about the questions that had come up. And I think for me, I would ask what kind of what we were discussing before, what would be the purpose of discussing it in the interview? What function would that serve for you? And how would it kind of solidify what you were trying to say, or, you know, what value would it have? So I guess it's different for every person of what feels important in that moment of what you want to discuss. But I think wider than that, it is something that maybe gets discussed once you kind of get on the other side of things.
I think that's really helpful thinking, bringing us back to that kind of, you can have a whole list of things that you might want to talk about depending on the questions, but on the day, what you talk about needs to be guided by the questions that you're asked and what the interviews are trying to get from you. Danielle, did you want to add to that too?
Yeah, it was just to kind of echo what Lauren and Molly May have said. It didn't really occur to me. I went to I only applied to Scottish universities. Obviously, I've got Glaswegian accent, so for me, it was never a kind of barrier that I felt like I had to overcome. But just kind of anecdotally speaking to some members of my cohort that have moved up from England, I know that was something they were really worried about. Actually, they were really worried about if there was kind of terminology, and obviously in Scotland we've got our own kind of Scots slang terms that we use, and there's a lot of dialect that we'll say, and they were really anxious about things getting lost. And obviously I can't really speak for them, but it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue now as it was at the beginning. They were really anxious to begin with, but I think they were kind of worried about maybe how they were going to be treated coming from England and having an English accent. And I would like to say it's not been an issue, but obviously I can't really talk for them. But I've certainly not heard them kind of having any negative experiences about it. And sometimes it is a bit of a way in, a bit of humour and ice breaking to, if they say like Dreek, you can say, oh, do you know, what do you mean by Dreek? I've not heard that before, kind of thing. And just kind of being curious. And but again, I've been quite fortunate because I've not really had to move or anything. So yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. And I think, yeah, sometimes what we imagine a situation to be like can be a lot worse than maybe what we come across when we get there. Will, do you want to?
Yeah, just to pick up on, I think what everyone said, I didn't think about it much in an interview either. I think because I just assumed that I talk normally and it's the rest of you that all talk funny. So that was maybe my worldview. But I think for me, I think in an interview context, I'd be encouraging you to think about it as an aspect of your identity, which may be made up of lots of different things, you know, down to, I don't know, everything else, you know, where you're from, how you dress, how you wear your hair, whether you've got tattoos, what music you like, I don't know, everything that makes us who we are. Because I think, again, thinking about it from the perspective of an interviewer, I'm looking to recruit people who I know can work with anyone, because that's our job as a clinical psychologist. We can't just work with people who are from the same place that we're from or who like the same music that we do. So I think being able to reflect on your own identity and what makes you you, being aware of maybe where you need to be a bit careful or where you need to work a bit harder or where you need to think a bit carefully about how you come across, and also where your strengths might be within that. And I think that's something that's come out as a theme in quite a lot of the webinars we've held previous, about how if you come from a working class background, it might be actually be a bit of a strength for you to then be able to connect with people in a different way. So I think being able to think about it in terms of what might be more difficult for you, but also what your strengths might be, based on your kind of your sense of who you are as a person in a holistic sense. Now, I don't know whether you'll get asked a question that taps into that specifically, but I think that's a helpful thing to be thinking about, and to pick on what somebody said before, to have as a lens to be thinking about how you approach the work that you might do as a trainee clinical psychologist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think bringing it back to identity as a whole and what makes you incorporates all these different things, and some parts of that might be relevant to a question, some might not. It's, yeah, about what those questions are on the day.
I'm just wondering if sorry, Chloe, I'm just wondering if anyone else wanted to share any of their experiences of talking about like their class background at interview, like how it felt or what the reception was, how they felt it was kind of received or anything. Or how, Will or Janice, you know, receive it as interviewers. Danielle.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but I kind of felt as though it was seen as a strength almost. And the reason again it came up, and I think it's been kind of spoken about, that the reason I brought it up is because I was talking about what I learned from it, what I learned from kind of going to Open University rather than a kind of brick university, and why that was the only option for me, because I had to kind of work in what that taught me and all the kind of qualities that it helped me develop. So for me, I kind of felt as though I was selling myself almost, and that was a strength that I was able to kind of discuss. And I did speak about being first generation kind of university as well, because it's something I'm proud of. And I think, again, it's given me probably a bit of a unique outlook, because I feel privileged to have my education, and I'm very aware of it. As to be educated, I'm privileged, and there is a power imbalance there as well a lot of the time, and probably more so than a lot of people. I'm very aware of that because of my background and the area that I've came from, and the kind of the struggles with poverty and socioeconomic kind of status that I've lived through. So it felt empowering for me to talk about it, and my perception was that it was kind of taken as a strength, and it was taken as a positive during the interview. So yeah.
Thanks, Danielle. That's really nice to hear that it was positive, because I guess the purpose of asking that question is for people who might be a bit worried about talking about it, and maybe just sharing how you found it might make people feel more confident to mention it, because from our perspective it feels like a great thing to mention and a really strengths-based, but it can still be really nerve-wracking when you may only have one interview, I suppose, and you're like, do I mention this or not? Will?
I think Danny actually completely stole the point I was going to make there. What I was going to say was, I really like it when people show that they have good insight into where they are more privileged and maybe where they are less privileged, because I think that's a really nice way to show that you're able to reflect on kind of what makes you you, and then how might that play out in your work. I think you know, at the end of the day, none of us choose where we come from. We come from where we come from. But I think sometimes people, you know, in interviews, I've seen people who've maybe not necessarily shown that they can recognise the privileges that have helped get them to where they are. Similarly, I think there's been people who I've definitely can remember an interview who have maybe not. They've maybe talked about some struggles or adversity that they've experienced for whatever reason, but haven't necessarily kind of closed the loop and helped us understand how that makes them a better candidate to be a trainee clinical psychologist. So I think really trying to think about what that means for you is important. And I obviously can't go into detail just for privacy reasons, but when you ask that question, Liz, I can think off the top of my head of lots of people in interviews who have talked about elements of their identity in a very authentic, genuine way. And to me, that just gives me a really lovely sense of, okay, this is who that person is. This is why I think this is why they would be good at doing this job. And it kind of, for me, it makes me smile when those are the bits in my interview when I see that person. Those are the bits of their interview that I remember. You know, those are the bits that really help kind of bring it to life a bit. So I think if you can do it well, if you can do it safely, if you can bear in mind the things we've chatted about, I think it can be a huge strength to be able to reflect on and talk about yourself in these elements of your identity.
Thanks, Will. It's helpful to have your perspective as well from the opposite end, and like hearing those answers. My like toolbar's up, so I didn't see who put their hand up first, but maybe it was mine. I'm sorry, Lauren, if it was you.
I do think it was Lauren, sorry. Yeah, I think I found that the panel were like really curious, and if anything, they just like probed me more to think about kind of my answer more. But they were quite interested in hearing about, I guess, those aspects of identity. And I think I did reflect on it, as Will was saying, about through the lens of like intersectionality, in recognizing that, you know, I'm also, you know, a white, cisgendered, heterosexual female, and how, you know, there are many kind of parts of my identity that offer that privilege as well. So yeah, but yeah, I felt really kind of validated, and yeah, I think it was like perceived as a strength. And I think, yeah, I got a genuine sense that they were interested, and they were like, oh, you know, thank you for sharing that. That's really like interesting to hear about, and yeah, makes a lot of sense with kind of, you know, your journey and kind of where you've come to now. Yeah, it was really helpful in my interview. Like, they did lots of summarizing at the end as well, and like saying, you know, actually that's really nice to hear that, like, that makes loads of sense given, you know, that experience, so thank you. And it was kind of like, oh, okay, like that was an okay thing to talk about. So I got the sense that that yeah, it was invited. And I think, yeah, for me it was like nice to know that that course like had that ethos where you could share kind of aspects of your identity and it would be received in like a really positive way, even if it does make you feel kind of slightly vulnerable to talk about initially. But yeah, I found it helpful to practice with like friends and family, or even just like recording myself out loud and like hearing it back to myself and hearing like whether it sounded like a balanced kind of answer, and whether like I'd spoken about, yeah, my identity in a way that felt that I want it to be heard, if that made sense. So yeah.
That sounds like a good experience, and actually what it sounds like is those recordings that you did helped you identify if you'd close that loop that Will was talking about, because I think that is really important when you're in interviews. Just make sure that there is a point to your answer. You're not just stating a fact about yourself, you're linking it back to what the question is, and that it has a purpose to what you're saying. So thanks. Lauren?
I think for me, if I remember rightly, I spoke about my class identity in regards to power and power dynamics. And that's how it kind of came about. And I certainly hadn't planned to discuss my class identity within my interview, but it just kind of happened, to be honest. It felt like it fit, and it happened. I did speak about kind of privilege and my privilege and the kind of position of privilege I'm currently in, through the kind of having been an assistant and now obviously being, you know, a trainee. I reflect on that quite a lot, but obviously my identity and my background have also been a part of that loop and that journey, and I think for me in my interview, I felt originally that it hadn't been received very well because my interviewers were very kind of stone-faced, didn't want to kind of give anything. But then at the end, they were very much like, "You've done really well today. You know, today's been great. Thank you for coming," kind of thing. And those really kind of positive verbal cues. But actually, in the moment, I was like, "Oh God, I've just waffled on about my class identity for absolutely no reason." And you do feel that kind of panic, but actually it's okay if you don't get any response, because sometimes some interviewers will be like that. They will want to kind of keep their composure whilst they're going through the motions of the interview, because just as much as you're going into an interview with how you're coping with it, I can imagine some interviewers go into it with a way that they want to cope with an interview. So and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you've done wrong. It doesn't mean you're doing badly. It just means that that's their process equally as much as you're doing your processes.
Excellent. Yeah, like thinking about, I suppose it's taking that other perspective again, like what is it that might be going on for the interviewers that I'm picking up on here as well. Janice?
I was just going to share a little bit about as an interviewer what you're also doing while you're listening to the interviewee talk. So you're making a few notes, because at UCL we score and then we get together afterwards and we come up with a consensus score for each response. So you have to be able to kind of justify your score, and so you have to make notes about what the person's saying and so on and so forth, and then think about a score on the spot as well. So sometimes if we're not as responsive to you, it's because we're multitasking. So we're listening and we're doing a whole load of other things at the same time. So it just made me reflect on what we're actually doing in that space while we're listening to the interviewee talk, that might look like we're not as responsive as we could be, but there's a lot going on beneath the surface.
It's also really hard, sorry to jump in, it's really hard work concentrating for that long. We're all qualified clinical psychologists doing the interviewing, but we're also human beings. And last year, for example, I think I did 3 days of interviews solidly. By the end of the third day, my brain was mush. I think it is just I appreciate that's a very privileged thing for me to say. It's hard being the interviewer, but I think again, just sort of remember that, don't take it personally if your interviewers aren't maybe as warm and bubbly as they might otherwise be, or as you might want them to be. Don't get in your head about that. I think it might not necessarily be about you. In fact, it probably isn't about you. It's probably because they've had quite a busy week and have had lots of other things to think about.
That whole putting yourself in the interviewer's shoes again, if they're a human being too, and they have, like you've just said, Janice, you've got so many other things to do whilst that interview is taking place, of writing notes down, thinking about what's being said. And I guess going into that interview, as a kind of interviewee, you don't really think about those things in the first moment. You're just kind of like, they are just going to listen to exactly what I'm going to say, and that's it. But actually, there's a lot more going on. There's a lot of moving parts to the interviews. It isn't just you going and saying stuff. There's lots of moving parts to it, and I think sometimes that can get lost, and that human element gets lost in it, and it's important to remember it.
I was also thinking, especially on those interview days, it is very paced, and I know Lauren, you were saying that you had other tasks to do, so you're really conscious when you're doing the interview as well, especially when you're asking the questions and monitoring how long people are taking on the answers, that you've got to be finished within a certain amount of time to give the interviewee chance to go and do whatever task they've got to do next. And so there are a lot of moving parts, and so perhaps if we do sort of move you on in terms of a response, it's because we're having to manage time to give you the best chance possible to have enough time between the tasks that you're being asked to do as part of that interview, and to make sure that we've got some time before we invite the next person in, and so on and so forth. So there just is I don't expect people to feel sorry for me, but it just, in terms of perhaps, as Lauren was saying, in terms of perhaps if you don't necessarily get the response that maybe you thought your answer might have solicited, or if you are sort of closed down on a response, it might well just be that we've just got an eye on the clock and just need to make sure things keep moving through and you get a chance to answer all the questions.
I think these are all really important. Sorry, Will. I was just going to say these are all really important aspects of that conversation about self-care, and hopefully hearing some of these things from your perspectives around what's going on for an interviewer will be part of that kind of, this is not necessarily a bad interview, I don't need to beat myself up for this. It's because these people have all these different tasks to do, time management, note taking, scoring. It's not necessarily a response to me. But Will, what were you going to say?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say that, I think there's a bit of a class element to the attributions that get made there. I can imagine, I don't know, I can imagine a young Boris Johnson coming along to a clinical psychology interview. If he doesn't get a very warm response, he isn't going to assume that's anything to do with him, right? Whereas I think somebody maybe, shouldn't really pick on Boris Johnson, should I? But anyway, he can handle it. I think there's something about the attributions that maybe we make. If you're perhaps from a more marginalized group, or if you've not had that background of exposure to those kinds of professional interview type settings, you're going to be much more at risk of assuming that it's you that's done something wrong, or assuming that it's you that's bored the interview panel, or assuming that you've not given a good answer, when actually it might be nothing to do with you. It might be all the other things we've been chatting about. So I just wanted to sort of say that again, I think there's a bit of a practice element to it and a bit of an experience element to it that people perhaps from more marginalized backgrounds maybe have a bit less opportunity to get, you know. If Boris Johnson happens to be watching this, then apologies, but not really, you know.
I think that's it's a really important point around all of those systems we talked about. Bronfenbrenner's Brenner's ecological systems theory earlier, like all of that stuff plays into our reactions on the day, and reflecting on that can be a helpful, it can make us better at our jobs, being aware of how those things impact us. And that goes into the interview again too. It's another loop. Janice, you had your hand up.
I was just going to share something from when I did my interview at UCL, and because it was face to face then, and unfortunately I could see the scores of one of the interviewers next to me, and so I was scoring sixes and sevens, and I came out of the interview and I thought, God, that can't possibly be good enough. And I burst into tears, and I went away thinking I'd really messed up and there was no way I was going to be allowed on, because I just assumed, I think as any kind of rational person would, that it was out of 10. And it was only when I started doing the interviews myself that I realized the UCL scoring's out of 8. and so that thought about, you know, those attributions that you're making and the assumptions that you're making, and you know, about what's happening within an interview and how those can just be based on completely inaccurate information. And I just thought I'd share my own experience of doing exactly that.
That's really helpful, and it's a really neat example of what we're talking about as well. Liz, you've got your hand up.
I know, but it's because I wanted to add something, not ask a question. I was going to say that from what people have said, bringing yourself is really important, and we've talked about that throughout the whole thing. And one of the tips that, it wasn't for the DClinPsy interviews, but someone gave me once, was think about 3 things that you want to get across to the interview panel before you leave, like about yourself, that you want to leave them with. And I think that's always been really helpful. So no matter what the question is, and I know we've talked about not shoehorning questions in, but I think this is slightly different if you think about who you are as a person and your values. But what do you want to leave that impression with people? What is it about you that you definitely want to get across? And I mean, I obviously haven't interviewed for anything since getting on the DClinPsy side, but I've always found that a really helpful tip as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes we can forget that it's a job interview at the end of the day. I know I definitely did when I was interviewing. We've had a question on the Padlet that's Boris Johnson related. How did any of you in the interviews, or when you've been interviewing people, did you have any experiences of talking? How appropriate does that feel to you? And is there a line? Kind of, can you speak to anything around those kind of topics? Because, yeah, I think when I saw that question, I was kind of thinking about how my personal values and my political values might be quite linked as well. So if anyone has any thoughts around that. Lauren, you've got your hand up.
I think I didn't go overly political in my interview, but I spoke about kind of some of the wider policies and political kind of aspects in regards to the NHS and how that can kind of feed into the kind of role of clinical psychology. So I think in terms of my prep, one of the things I looked at was kind of the broader role of clinical psychology within the NHS organisation, and kind of how that kind of plays a role in terms of what we do as leaders within the NHS, and why that's important. And I looked at a few kind of really important reports that had come out. So I think I looked at the Francis report. My brain now is like, no. And I think it was the Winterbourne as well, and why they were important and what they showed. Because I think for me, I could probably talk about politics all day, but actually it wouldn't be very helpful for me in terms of my interview. I think it feeds into my identity, and I could have talked about it. I just chose not to. It didn't feel quite right for me. And it makes me think about what Will was saying before about all those little bits that make up your identity. And if you feel it's appropriate and it's right to get that across, then that's important. But what function does it serve? What purpose? How is it kind of adding to what you're trying to say? And for me personally, talking about my political views and kind of my views on the UK at the moment wouldn't have been very helpful.
Yeah, there's political with a big P and kind of party politics and electoral politics, and then there's political with a little p and how power affects our jobs and how that links together. And it sounds like from what you're saying that the little p political stuff feels quite relevant. The big P political stuff, not so much. Danielle, you had your hand up too. I don't know if it was you or Will first. Forgive me if I got you the wrong way around.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Yeah, I think just when I was thinking about that, because I was a bit stumped initially at that, but I think I did to a certain extent, and it was more in relation to policy. I think I spoke about the mental health strategy. I spoke about, I think, without disclosing too much about the question, I think the question was around where do you see clinical psychology in the next kind of 10 years or something to that kind of effect of where do you see the role kind of changing. So I think I did speak about policy a lot during that question, and I spoke about the kind of burdens on the NHS. I spoke about the kind of political landscape and mental health resources. Actually, I think I spoke about kind of cost of living crisis even at that point, and how all of the kind of social kind of inequalities are confounding the mental health kind of crisis. So I did touch upon politics in hindsight, in the kind of global sense, in the kind of wider sense of how it's impacting the population and what we will probably come across as a trainee clinical psychologist. But I also spoke about the NHS and the kind of shift in kind of frontline services and the stepped approach. And I did bring it back to the policies and all the kind of mental health strategy and all that kind of stuff as well, just to really illustrate that I had that awareness of what was going on in the service kind of thing and how that would impact me as a potential clinical psychologist, and obviously kind of with the workforce as well. And there's more roles that are kind of caps and things like that and PWPs, and there are more roles that we would take on kind of responsibility for supervision and training for. So yeah, there was a bit of politics, I suppose, my answer.
It sounds like you went on a bit of a journey when that question came up of absolutely not, actually. and that awareness of what's going on in the profession was something that was really key for you to get across. Thank you. Will, what were you going to say? And I noticed you put something in the chat as well that people might be interested in.
Yeah, so it's a couple of years old now, but I think hopefully the message should still be relevant. So this was a book chapter from Mazuma and Anne in a professional issues book that we edited a few years back. So they posed the question, should clinical psychologists be political? And if you can't be bothered reading it, I'll spoil it. The answer is yes, we should. So I in response to that question, I suppose that the bit I would add from my perspective, having seen people approach to try to sort of wrestle with this in interviews, I think where it's done well, I think firstly, I think it's about being respectful. I think just because I'm a big lefty and, me being a big lefty makes it easy for me to assume that anyone who doesn't agree with me is evil. That's not good, is it? Half the country's population isn't evil and wrong. That's nonsense. So me falling into the trap of implying that anyone who disagrees with me is wrong is a bit of a slippery slope, I would say. So just be a bit thoughtful about how you frame things and how you pitch things. That said, I think, for my money, I think you can't separate out clinical psychology work from the political landscape, you know, both in terms of like things that directly affect psychological well-being for the people that we work with, how political decisions affect different pockets of society in different ways, but then also the NHS context in which we work. You know, you just have to turn the news on to see where that's at the minute, you know, thinking about other maybe smaller political decisions that affect psychological work. I mean, IAPT's probably the last big development that completely changed the landscape in terms of how psychology functioned in the NHS. So I think being able to talk about and think about those big political type of decisions and how they might impact on the role of a clinical psychologist, I think is absolutely a really, really good thing to be talking about at an interview. Just be a bit thoughtful about how you do it and how that might come across, especially if you're potentially talking to someone who has very different political views to you, and how do you want that to kind of land?
That's really helpful and a really great resource for people if they're thinking about talking about this, is to kind of ground that in stuff they've read as well that's psychology appropriate. Lauren, you've got your hand up.
I'm wondering whether, if somebody wanted to discuss the politics, whether it could be something they brought up as part of discussing a case, or, how that kind of difference in political opinion could kind of impact in terms of working with a case. If you have one perspective and the person you're working with has another, how would that make you feel? And that kind of reflective practice on that. If you feel maybe like you can't articulate what you're wanting to say about politics specifically, maybe trying to kind of reframe why you want to talk about the politics in terms of something else might be helpful, is what kind of came to mind for me when Will was talking then.
Yeah, when you and it reminded me of something that I spoke about in an interview of working with someone who's affected by the Windrush stuff around immigration, and I didn't necessarily talk about my views on that, but I did talk about how that policy was impacting on working with and how that affected the work. And it sounds like that's what everyone is kind of thinking is a helpful way of approaching this kind of stuff, rather than personal views and opinions. I'm seeing a lot of nods, so I'm hoping everyone agrees.
Yeah, I'd probably go down that route rather than just slagging Boris Johnson. Wouldn't advocate that. Save that for after.
I'm just thinking, because we've got kind of just less than half an hour now, I know we also spoke about maybe talking about structuring answers, and maybe some practical tips or things to think about for people, for answers, where maybe people say things like quite a lot of words but doesn't really say anything, which everyone is guilty of. My first DClinPsy application was probably just like buzzword bingo, like we've all done it, we all know it. Like, it's not a criticism, but if you want to kind of move forward, the key theme that's come up is this need to be reflective, link it back to things, close the loop. But I also think that's quite a hard skill if this is your first time with interviews, if you don't know anyone, like if you haven't got that much social capital. So if we could maybe talk about that a bit. Someone shared about there being kind of 4 main themes-ish to questions, and this is the same, I think, with NHS jobs or any other jobs. There's always an underlying question, like what's underlying the question, what does the interviewer actually want to hear? And these tend to be things like general ones about you as a person and your values, telling people about a time when, so like a clinical vignette, it could be scenarios, like what would you do in this scenario, to see how you'd handle different situations, questions about your opinions, and then questions about what knowledge you have. So I thought maybe if we could, I don't really know how we want to do this, but just discuss this. as a bit to help people start to think about how they might answer that question in a way that helps them stand out, whether that be bringing out their class identity or just not to waste their opportunity to say something because they're hung up on saying like this model in 1963 and this is the disadvantage, or I don't know, but you know what I mean. Lauren, I'm going to go to you. Actually,
okay.
no, I'm not. Well, I mean, I can go to you, but I actually thought it was your hand, but my team switched around because Will went off camera and messed it up, so I just want to blame it on her. Danny, it's actually you with your hand up.
No, it was. Oh, sorry, my mic wasn't even on there. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So no, I was just thinking about a strategy that I use quite a lot, and this is kind of from when I used to interview for jobs, and it was the STAR approach. I don't know if you've heard of it. I've actually had to Google it, full disclosure, because I couldn't remember what they stood for. But so you start off by kind of thinking about the situation, and then you'll kind of talk about what your task, so what your responsibility. And I think I used this when it came from like a clinical example. This was the structure that I followed. So I thought about the kind of presentation and then what I'd done, like what was my role. And at that point I was an AP, so it was guided self-help that we done. And then I thought about kind of action-wise, so what was the process? Kind of I supported the clinical psychologist to formulate. And what did that look like? What was my specific tasks within that? And then we devised like a kind of intervention plan, and again, what was my role kind of, and what was my learning from that? And then you think about the results. What was the result for the patient, but also for you? And then that kind of ties into the reflection. So reflecting on, did it work? Would you do it differently now? In hindsight, is there anything really that could have been kind of tweaked? Is there anything that you felt wasn't as effective as it could have been? And that for me was really helpful. I think actually I had STAR wrote in my hand at one point, just to kind of to prompt it, to try and, because obviously I'm sitting waffling now, I'm a bit of a waffler, so it was quite good for me just to kind of pull it back together.
I would second that, Danielle. I used the STAR like as a bit of a template in my head to answer the questions that I was asked to. I think Will's posted a link to the STAR method for interviews in the chat as well, if people are interested in that. Lauren, you've got your hand up.
I think I used something very similar. I looked at the STAR method, but I felt like it didn't quite fit for kind of some of the other questions that I might get asked. So I kind of thought to myself, okay, I'm going to think about what I want to say, why it's relevant, and then link it back to the question. Because I think for myself, in any interview I've ever done, I ended up going on a massive waffle about the what of what I'm trying to say, and then I never actually link it back. So that kind of idea of closing the loop again. So I had to kind of actively remind myself of linking it back. Why is what I'm saying relevant? Why does it matter? Because I think, especially in an interview, it is that I think for at least a couple of the questions, I wanted to get everything out of my head. And I think you can get caught in the trap of, okay, I'm done now. And actually you haven't closed that loop. You've kind of left with maybe some uncertainties that still aren't answered, and taking that breath and thinking, okay, actually hold on a second, I need to close that down again. And I think with the case examples, I try to think of it of the assessment, formulation, intervention, evaluation when I was talking about my case examples. So what was the presentation? How was it assessed? What was the formulation? What kind of intervention, or if that hadn't gone ahead, what could it have been? And then evaluation based things. And I guess evaluations didn't need to be kind of psychometrics or outcome measures or anything like that. It could be the kind of conversation you had with that person and how they felt it had gone, or how you felt it had gone, which is where I was able to bring in that reflective kind of practice of how I felt that case had gone, what could have gone better. But it followed that good kind of structure that on the course you will be using quite frequently. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And coming back to closing that loop has made me wonder, I know Will and Janice have both got their hands up, but what kind of happened for you in the interview to kind of prompt that, okay, now I need to close this down? Because I think it would be an important thing to help people to notice when that happens. If we come to Will and Janice first, then you've got some time, everyone's got some time to think about that. But Will, I think you were first.
Yeah, just in response to that that comment, Chloe, I think sometimes, well, as an interviewer, you're trying to give people the best possible chance. Nobody gets into doing interviewing for DClin courses because they're mean and want to punish applicants. Like we're there because we want to sort of help. We're there because we want to give people the best possible chance. So I think sometimes, being mindful of time limits, being mindful of things like that. Sometimes you can kind of tell that an applicant is maybe not going anywhere, and it's okay. It's time to bring this one to a close. Or the flip side is, actually, you've given us enough here. That's enough. We can move on to something else and give you a chance to give us some more information in another context. And so I think that would be what I'd say for that. I think the other things I want to say, well, two points really. First, I think I would say be as familiar as you can be with the specific nature of the interview at the courses that you're applying to. So, for example, at Lancaster, we use a competency-based interview framework, and there's lots of information about this on our website. And basically, we tell you what those competencies are, and we score people based on those competencies. There's nothing that's kind of hidden or secret about it. So, if I was applying for the Lancaster programme, that would be what I would be studying and practicing and answering questions around those competencies. Do you know what I mean? So I think use the information that the courses provide you. Every course interviews in a slightly different way, but use whatever information they give you to help you think about what approach is going to help you answer questions in a good way. It might be that there's something like the STAR method that was mentioned earlier. Things like that can be really helpful in structuring your thinking, but give yourself the best chance by tailoring that to the nature of the interview content. And I think the other thing I just wanted to say, which is maybe more of a general comment, is it's okay to have a think about your interview skills as a competency that might need a bit of honing or a bit of practice. And that's probably not something we do a lot. We talk a lot about what kind of experience do you need to get onto the doctorate, and there's lots of discussion on AP groups and what have you about things like that. But actually, often the thing that makes the difference is how people handle interviews. And before I got on training, I was applying for lots of different assistant jobs and research jobs, and pretty much any job that came out, I was applying for it. I was going to interviews all the way up and down the country, not having any luck whatsoever. And my mate, as a bit of a laugh, I think, or maybe a bit mean, I don't know, but went to the pound shop and bought me a book like how to do a job interview or something, because I was kind of going and not doing so well at any of these interviews. And he sort of didn't mean it to, he meant it as a joke, but it was actually dead helpful. Probably should buy him a beer, and thank you for that, actually, in retrospect. But it was actually really helpful because it was the first time I'd ever properly stopped and thought about, how am I coming across at these interviews? How am I structuring my answers? What is it I'm trying to achieve in what I'm saying? And things like the STAR method and other bits and pieces that are out there, there's lots of similar things out there, can be helpful, but fundamentally the thing that I think of when I think back to nosing through that book all those years ago was, there was a point in there where it was basically, think about what the question is actually trying to get at. If they're asking you a question about, I don't know, tell us about a time when you managed a risk issue, what are they really asking you there? What are they actually trying to get you to showcase? And I'd take that mindset in a DClin context. I'd take that to any aspect or any bit of a selections task, whether it's a role play or a group task or whatever. What are the interviewers trying to sort of establish? What are they trying to give you some space to showcase? think about that and then do it, then showcase it, you know. It may be that that's showing knowledge, it may be that it's showing skills, it may be that it's showing reflection or awareness of something. But the more that you can show what they're looking for, the more success you're likely to have, I'd say. So yeah, I would say just it. Sometimes people get a bit caught up in reading all about CBT or reading all about the different psychology stuff. You know, I think there's so much stuff out there about like more general interview tips and interview strategy that, you know, that can be worth your time as well. That can be worth a bit of a look.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're saying touches on that. It's still an interview. It's on this pedestal, and it's clinical psychology, and it's the thing a lot of people have worked at for a lot of time. But we need to be good at an interview to get through that hurdle. Janice, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, you know, if you are talking about a case in an interview, or if you're talking about a specific situation, you don't need to tell us absolutely everything about that case or absolutely everything about that situation. Think about, you know, you're telling a story, and you're telling a story with a specific goal in mind. Back to Will's point about think about what it is, that the reasons why we're actually asking you that question, and then that's all you need to tell us. So then if you're kind of halfway through it and you remember you've forgotten some little bit of information about the person, if it's not relevant to the question, just put it out of your mind and just carry on, and just think about really focusing on the bits of the story, on the bits of the narrative that are relevant to the question, and telling us those, rather than the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I think the other thing that I would say was, you know, I think it's okay to kind of summarize your points, the points that you've made at the end, but just do it once. I think, you know, we all have a tendency to keep repeating ourselves to make sure that we've been heard and understood, but once is enough. I'm about to do it myself, aren't I, by going, you only need to do it once. Yeah, I do think it is a tendency that we have, but, you know, just bear in mind the time constraints that we're under. So if you've summarized your points once, then just leave it.
Yeah, and I think I tried to stop myself from doing that when I was interviewing by saying things like, I could talk more about this, but I feel like I'll start waffling, so I can move on now. And kind of talking through that process out loud helped me to say less at times when it wasn't so relevant. Lauren, you've got your hand.
Sorry, even just asking Chloe, even just saying like, is that enough detail? Have I answered your question? You know, that for me was a bit of a game changer in interviews. You know, just it can be a conversation. It doesn't need to be that you need to talk non-stop for 10 minutes. You know, it can feel a bit of a two-way thing. You know, again, within reason, you don't want to be doing that every time. But if you're not sure, just checking in with your interviewers. Has that captured what you were looking for there?
I think especially where interviews are still online, because I think it can be harder to pick up on those cues that you've said enough, and it's okay to stop. So I think it is worth bearing that in mind, the slightly artificial nature of if you're doing interviews and they're online.
That's really helpful. Lauren?
I was going to say, in answer to your question, Chloe, when I figured out that enough was enough and I needed to close the loop was when I started repeating myself and kind of summarising on my summary, and it was kind of like, no, this is enough now. And that's when I kind of closed the loop. And I think I practiced quite a lot of it out before the interview, but I have a tendency to say, did you understand that? Does that make sense? And when I practiced it with my partner, he was like, you're constantly kind of saying, does that make sense? Well, yes, it makes sense. Have I said it doesn't make sense? And I think that probably comes from my identity and sometimes the way that I articulate myself, that I worry it's not as clear as I would like it to be. But it was helpful to get that out before the interview, so that there was only a couple of times where I really kind of waffled on a bit too much and was like, okay, that's enough now. And I think as well, I found it helpful to reflect on interviews I'd done previously, because it is another interview. And there's themes from previous interviews that may come up in the doctorate interview, around kind of equality, diversity, inclusion, things like that. And all experience is good experience. And if there's been an interview that you felt you've performed really well in, reflecting on that and why that went well is really helpful. What was it that made you feel that interview had gone well? How did you kind of wrap things up in that interview? Because although this is, it feels big and it feels really important, it is still an interview. And those skills don't go away.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I feel like we closed the loop on closing the loop a bit with the combination of talking about repeating ourselves and repeating our summaries there. So hopefully that's been helpful for people. We wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions in the chat and on the Padlet. We've had a couple more on the Padlet that I've not read out just yet. So if you're
listening, one question, Chloe, before you do the Padlet, and I don't want to put Will on the spot, but I will, because you've spoken about it a bit before. But we were just talking about answers and closing the loop, etc., etc. Could you, and you might not be able to, so if you can't, we might email it later, but like give an example of an answer that says something but nothing, and maybe an answer that says a bit more. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. An answer that says something of nothing.
Like you're saying a lot of words, but actually there's no real content behind it. Just because I'm aware that we've said, try and make sure you do this, this, and this, and people might not know what an answer that says something and nothing sounds like.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and freestyle improv one off the top of my head, but I think what I would say is